Hi, everybody. Thank you, Annette, and thank you to everybody at the Jane Addams College of Social Work for having me here today. I'm really excited to speak with you. So I hope that you can all hear me okay. Of course, my next door neighbor has decided to do their lawn right as, I'm starting to speak, but, what can you do? So hopefully you can hear me. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. I will, just make sure if you can't see it for any reason that you let me know somehow. Let's see, oops. Okay, let's see. Current slide. Okay, so hopefully you can all see this and hear me. So today I'm going to be talking about understanding youth suicide and taking action, and doing this really with the school social worker in mind. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about some recent statistics with youth suicide. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite studies that I've done on understanding youth suicide, and talk a little bit about the lessons learned from that study. Then talk more about the role of schools in what we can do to prevent suicide among our youth, including screening, assessment, prevention, intervention, and postvention. I'm really going to focus my talk, given that we don't have a ton of time, on the screening, assessment, and intervention portions of that. But certainly feel free to ask any more prevention and postvention types of questions if you have them as well. There, you can put any questions you have for me throughout the talk in the Q&A, and I will do my best to be able to click on it and answer it as we go through this. But don't, so definitely ask questions throughout, but we will hopefully also have time at the end to do any final Q&A before we end. So let's just start with some of the statistics here. We know that suicide is the second leading cause of death among teens, and this is the most recent stats we have from 2019 is the most recent ones we have right now. But what to know when you go into the CDC website, into the Whiskers website, where you can really look at all these stats by age, what you find out is that actually for 14 and 15-year-olds, suicide is the leading cause of death. So we want, especially as we're working in schools, this is a huge thing to consider. When we break it down a little bit, we see that when we look at the suicide rates by age group, we can see here that for females on the left, males on the right, we can see that it really starts to spike in this 15 to 24-year-old age group for female and males, but really especially for the males, we can see that here. But what we need to understand too is we can't always just rely on the numbers here, because we have to look at the rates and how they're changing. And what we know now recently is this rate of suicide by females is increasing relative to males. And a lot of this is because females are adopting more lethal means than males. So this is something to pay attention to as well. And this whole idea that male teens die by suicide 3 times more than females, that's an important thing to know. But females attempt suicide more often than males, which is also a public health problem, because basically in my mind, any teen who has a desire to die and is going to act on it is a concern. So whether or not it's an attempt or a suicide death, it should be something that we all pay attention to as school clinicians. Then when we look at suicide rates by race, we can see that the highest here is the Native American teens. So we really need to be paying attention to this. They're a group that is adversely affected by suicide. And it's so if you're in schools that have a higher population of NAAI students, you want to make sure you're aware of this. But the thing too to recognize here is that we can be blinded by these numbers that we see Black students, or Black teens, they're not so high. But what we're seeing recently is that the suicide rate among Black youth is increasing faster than any other racial or ethnic group. So this is another thing we need to keep our eye on here. Another group we need to keep our eye on are the LGBTQ population. They are at highest risk for suicide. And a recent study by the Trevor Project found that 42% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. And that includes more than half of transgender and non-binary youth. One thing too that I think is the most interesting thing when we look at these stats is this right here, this Trevor Project study. This was the entire sample identified as LGBTQ. Okay, so when we look at the race breakdown here in this subset, you can see that actually white youth, who are higher in the general population with respect to their risk level for suicide, they're at 12%, where when we look at within this subset of LGBTQ teens, we see, Native and Indigenous youth, 31%, and Black youth, 21%, so much higher than white. And multiracial youth, 21%, Latinx youth, 18%. And then, so then we can see there that the importance of looking at intersectionality when we look at risk for suicide among youth. So let's take a look here at suicide mortality rates from 2000 to 2020. So over the past years, what have we seen here? So what we see is for both male and female, suicide rates were lower in 2020 than in 2018 and 2019. So people might be saying, oh, and I'm sure you've been seeing some of this in the news, like, oh, the suicide rate dropped in 2020. What's going on? You'd think with COVID, it would get worse because what a horrible time in everyone's lives. But I want to caution everybody on that, especially people working with youth, because as we look even closer and break this down, we can see that female suicide rates have declined for all age groups over age 25, but they've increased for ages 10 to 24. So this is a really important thing for us to look at. For males, they have declined in ages over 45, but for ages 10 to 14, it's followed an interesting pattern where it went down briefly from 2000 to 2007 and then went up again through 2020. And for the ages 15 to 24, they were statistically unchanged. Another interesting thing that's come about is that in 2020, the leading means for suicide for females was firearms, which this is a change from previous years. As you can see, starting around 2002, it's always been poisoning has been kind of the main way that females have attempted suicide or died by suicide, I should say. But what's happened, as you can see, over time, firearms have really started to increase there, as has suffocation and mostly hangings here for females. So we're seeing that females over time are really using more lethal means, which is what is explaining this closing of a gap between male and female suicide death rates. For males too, firearms are also increasing, although not as fast as a rate as females, but they are also continuing to increase here. And obviously with everything that's been happening in our schools recently and gun control laws and the heightened controversy among all of this in our country, this is something that we should be paying attention to. Okay. An issue here is that other rates of mortality are decreasing relative to suicide. So let's take, for example, motor vehicle accidents. Okay. Look at this from 1999 till now. Okay. Over the past 20 years, we see that motor vehicle accidents accounted for a larger proportion of deaths than suicide or homicide. And what's happened over time is we see MVA deaths going down significantly, to the fact that I believe it was in 2017 or 2018, it was the first time ever that deaths by suicide were higher than deaths by motor vehicle accident. Now, you can imagine, I'm sure, and feel free to put this up in the chat, but imagine, what reasons this could be for what they're positing is the reasons for this are a few things. One is that they're thinking that picture the amount of money that's been put into making cars safer. That's in seatbelt laws and things like that. Okay, there's been a lot of money and time and effort put into that. And so a lot of people feel that that's part of the reason why we've been able to see this drop. But with suicide, we think about what was being done in 1999, basically nothing. And now we're, over time, we're trying to do more and more here, but we still haven't been able to really move this needle. So why can't we move the needle on suicide? I know this is an old graph, but for me, every time I see it, it takes my breath away, because I look at this, you look at this line for suicide that's increased from 2000 to 2016, okay? This 28% increase in suicide deaths over time. Look at all these other public health problems. Look at all these other medical issues that have seen decreases. We've got chronic respiratory disease gone down, cancer going down, heart disease going down, stroke going down. Why might this be? Again, think about the amount of money that's being put into research to help all of these things. So much more in the bottom 4 than the top of suicide. And there's still so much about suicide we don't understand. We know the factors that confer risk, okay? This is a simple infographic on the suicide warning signs. Like this, you can see that, like having hopelessness, isolation, feeling like a burden. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we know what the documented risk factors are. Okay, we've known this for a while, but just knowing the risk factors isn't minimizing the risk. The problem is we don't yet know how to predict who is going to go on to kill themselves. And this is because suicide is an extremely complex phenomenon. So what's happened over the past, I would say about 10 years, maybe a little bit less, is that a lot of scholars have argued for suicide research to be conducted within an ideation to action framework. So what we mean by that is it's not enough anymore to just look at who is at risk. What we need to figure out are, because there are a lot of people, a lot of individuals who have suicidal thoughts who don't then go on to kill themselves. So what is it? What is it about? What are these factors that push an individual from ideation to action? So that's really what a lot of scholars are saying is where we need to be putting our time and effort in order to increase the effectiveness of prevention programs and interventions. So this question is what led me to this study that I wanted to talk with you about. I'm going to check the Q&A quickly though to make sure I didn't miss anything. So I will keep, as I get to little stoppage points, I'll keep kind of going on to see if there's questions. So feel free to keep asking. And I see someone here did put in the idea of social media and apps. I'm sure this person, Paramita, I apologize if I didn't say your name right, but I feel like that's a good point, is that there is a lot of new things happening right now that are with respect to social media that are playing a role in youth suicide. And it's not the sole reason. I want to be very clear throughout this talk that there's no one reason why people kill themselves. And I hope this comes clear when I explain this next study to you. But that in fact, there are, a confluence of factors that have an interplay together that lead this to happen. So, oh, hold on. Sorry, I just lost it. Okay. So again, steps we need to take. We need to understand the sequence and interplay of various factors that contribute to suicide attempts and understand how they interact with each other to confer risk. And one way that I think is a very important step to take in our field that we're not really doing in suicide research as much is doing some qualitative investigation of this. And I know social workers love qualitative work because we are all, clinicians at heart who think it's so important to hear from the people you're studying directly and what they think. And so that's exactly what we embarked on in this one study here that I'm going to talk a little bit about with you, because it really gives a lot of voice to the lived experience of adolescents who have attempted suicide. And I found that from this study, I really grew in my understanding of why these kids tried to kill themselves. So the whole aim behind this study was to understand this process underlying suicide attempts. We did qualitative interviews with teens who'd recently survived a suicide attempt. It was about approximately a week after they'd attempted. And we wanted to investigate what the contributing factors were, as well as the interplay between those factors to answer this question of why adolescents attempt suicide. And we wanted, just as scholars had been asking about the specific attention to which factors facilitate this transition from ideation to action. So this is a small study, a sample of 20 teens, but that's pretty typical for qualitative studies. And they were all recruited from an inpatient psychiatric unit of an urban hospital, and they had recently survived a suicide attempt within the past week. So what we did in this study, and I'm just going to go over one piece of it because the overarching study was to develop a safety planning intervention, which I'll actually talk about later on when we talk about interventions. But we asked all the participants the same 3 questions, which gave us a structure for counting thematic codes across teens in the analyses. So the first question was, tell me why you're here today. What led up to your suicide attempt? And the second question is, how did you go from just thinking about suicide to actually trying to kill yourself? And the third question was, how much time passed between when you thought about it and when you actually did it? So those are kind of the 3 questions that I'm going to talk about the results for now. So with respect to the first question of the contributing factors to their suicide attempts, we asked them, tell me why you're here today. What led up to your attempt? And here are some of our findings. I'm going to go through some of these, but what we found essentially were 4 main categories, one being historical, okay? And under this historical category, we find things like psychiatric and medical history that contributed to it, a specific precipitating event, and trauma were 3 examples of historical factors, okay? So, and you can see here, like this one example of this precipitating event, my mom read my journal and it felt like she stole my life from me. This specific incident was a big component for this person. Another category we found was a sociocultural category. Now, what falls under that are things like school and extracurricular stress, as well as suicide contagion. Now, suicide contagion is a big thing that we want to look at, and we don't fully understand, I think, as a field, why. We do know suicide contagion is a real thing. That's, when there's a suicide death in one community, it can trigger future suicide deaths in the same community. We don't quite understand exactly why that is, but I do want to read this out loud because I think it's such a good example of it, which is what this adolescent teen said, where they said, how they talked about their suicidal desire intensified after my classmate, this is using their words, were committed suicide. We kept all their own words in, even though now we don't use the term committed, we use died by suicide. Because everyone was so upset and everyone was shocked and everyone was saying, how could he have done this to himself? How could he have felt so alone? And how come he wasn't able to tell anybody? I realized that made me feel even more alone because nobody understood how my classmate felt, which meant that nobody understood how I felt. So I really do feel like this is such a beautiful quote that really encapsulates this idea of contagion and why and how it affects other teens. So the other category was interpersonal. Okay, so a lot of things that fell into this were family conflict and peer conflict. These are the 2 main types of interpersonal issues that contributed to the suicide attempts in our population. Now, here's the 4th factor, though, is perhaps the most interesting factor that came up for us, and that was the intrapersonal factor. Underneath this factor, not everyone in the sample experienced historical, sociocultural, or interpersonal. Although they definitely had at least one, but definitely more of them. But what they all experienced was at least one or more of in the intrapersonal category. So in intrapersonal, we have this concept of burden, feeling a burden to others, thwarted belongingness, meaning they don't feel like they really belong to a group and they feel disconnected. Emotion dysregulation is another one. So really just feeling like you're unable to keep to not react so strongly to your emotions and to keep them in check. Other ones were feeling trapped. This was a big one that came up where just feeling trapped in a situation. Invalidation was another interpersonal factor that emerged in our population, not feeling validated by family or friends. Feeling guilt or shame were two other intrapersonal components. Having a lack of purpose or a reason for living came up, and as well as hopelessness. So those were the contributing factors. But now what I think is the more interesting question is, how did they go from just thinking about suicide to actually trying to kill themselves? So really leaning into this ideation to action framework and trying to really understand what pushed them, what propelled them to actually try to kill themselves. So this is what we found. We found that it was never really just one factor that contributed to or drove their attempt, but instead it was this confluence of factors that converged in such a way where the teen felt like suicide was their only option. So for instance, some of our teens in this study felt like they couldn't manage some of these chronic symptoms, and they were compounded by other sources of stress, which created strain on the adolescent. So this idea of strain is really important, especially as school social workers to be aware of, because we see these teens, and it's not always the teen who just gets, one really bad grade on a test, or, has one horrible thing happen in their family, or I'm just giving those as examples. It's usually the teen where they have a horrible thing happen in their family, and then they have something happen with their friends, and then they have something happen online, or, it's this strain, it's the cumulative effect of the multiple stressors. This is why I really want to warn people against labeling just one thing as causing it. Like social people are really, really often want to lean on bullying, social media, things like that. What we know is that this one thing doesn't cause an adolescent to kill themselves. It's when the strain becomes intolerable. And what happens then is it appears to manifest itself by means of an intrapersonal symptomatology, which I'm going to explain in a little more depth here. So I'm going to read this out loud because I think this quote of this teen really illustrates this. This teen says, "I had a fight with some friends and it resulted in a suicide attempt. It wasn't their fault, but it pushed me over the edge. We were fighting about something and they were trying to tell me it was all my fault. They were telling me how awful of a person I was. I had recently gotten in a fight with my parents and it was just like everything built up. Everything piled up and it was just like, I'm done. Can't do this anymore. I'd already been to 8 programs and it just seemed like anxiety and depression was never going to go away. And I couldn't do anything about it. Obviously, meds weren't doing very much. It just seemed like it took over my life. So I was just like, I'm done." So this is this idea of strain where there's so many factors for this teen that contributed to this, pushing this teen over the edge, as they put it, and to feel in that transition from ideation to action. What's important to know too from this sample, from this study, is that teens varied in their interpersonal struggles. So emotion dysregulation, burden, thwarted belongingness, all these different ones, they were different for different people, okay? But they, it was among all these participants that it was once these intrapersonal factors emerged or got worse at least, that this transition from suicide ideation to action took place. So therefore, what our study, this qualitative study, found is that the interpersonal factors seem to be the catalyst in this process from suicide ideation to action. So for example, emotion dysregulation, okay? It's basically if their sadness, anxiety, or anger felt so severe or unrelenting that suicide appeared the only option to them. So as this teen says, I guess I was depressed and there was a lot of homework. My mom's jealous of me going with my dad so much. I thought my family didn't even care about me. I guess I was just really tired of it. I just had anxiety all the time and I was thinking of a lot of bad thoughts. It's like literally my face turned red or something and then I just did it. So this face turning red, this kind of just unable to tolerate those emotions coming up. This is an example of when that, on top of all these other historical, sociocultural, interpersonal factors, it's that intrapersonal factor that really pushes it over the edge. I'm going to check this Q&A to see if, I see people keep moving them. Okay, that's fine. Must be answering them. Okay. So the next one, invalidation. We found this one a lot among our teens, that their family or friends didn't understand their emotional pain or what the teen was trying to communicate to them. And it felt to them this overwhelming sense of being invalidated. This is, cultural pieces came into play a lot here too. In our sample, we had a relatively diverse sample and where culture came in. Like, for example, too, in other differences, like gender differences, this one teen says, I tried to kill myself because my dad and me got in a fight. And he told me that I was a boy when I was a girl and I can't hang out with my friends who are also transgender and that I was a girl no matter what. He didn't really believe that's what I was and who I was. And I was trying to pretend to be something I'm not. For me, it was hard because that's how I felt and I couldn't change how I felt. So this is what this teen describes as their is why they attempted suicide, what transitioned them from just thinking about it to actually acting on it. This feeling of being trapped is another one too. Feeling trapped in one's feelings or a situation and where they feel like the only option is suicide to make this pain end. So like this child says, I sat in the corner. I was thinking like, I want to die. I need to die. That was the only thing I was thinking, like I needed to end. I don't know how long I was sitting there because there wasn't a clock. Then I grabbed a towel and I tried to hang myself from the shower rod. So this is what one individual says here and really details that exact moment for what was going on in their head. A lot of teens that talked about just things feeling overwhelming and feeling like death was a better option. This one teen talks about this in the context of chronic fighting with mom, saying, I would ask for her to stop fighting and she just wouldn't stop. I felt like I was trapped, like this was just going to happen until I moved out. Things would not have gotten better. And one thing we have to understand too, with this age group, okay, this teenage age group, is they haven't fully developed yet their capacity for abstract thought. Like this is why I really believe that this age is so at risk, because they have such a hard time weighing and really thinking about how things can possibly get better. There's a lot more all or nothing thinking in this age, a lot more concrete thinking, and it becomes really hard for them to problem solve in these moments simply due to where they're at with their brain development. I'm going to go to the Q&As, make sure there's nothing in here. Yes, hard copy, no problem. I can do that. What do I mean by intrapersonal? Thank you very much for bringing that up. And I apologize for not being clearer as I was talking, but what I mean, so if interpersonal means within people, intrapersonal means within oneself. So exactly so what I'm reading about right now, talking about with these intrapersonal factors here that are coming up, these are all things felt within oneself. And that's really, we were able to separate out into different themes that seem to contribute. So that's what I'm detailing now is these themes, the sub-themes underneath the theme of intrapersonal. But great questions, keep them coming. I want to make sure you're all getting out of this what you want and that it's making sense. Okay. So then we come to burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness, which we know from Joiner's research that the combination of the two are what his theory posits as what contributes to suicidal desire, feeling a burden to others and feeling a lack of belongingness. So two of them, two of these teens identified burdensomeness alone, two thwarted belongingness alone, and two was the combination that facilitated the transition. So like, here's what this teen says. There's no point in me being alive anymore because no one cares about me. So I need to kill myself because I feel bad for being in other people's lives when they don't care about me. And I just make it harder for other people. So these are this is an example of how these two intrapersonal components push this teen to attempting suicide. Lack of purpose or reason for living is another one, another interpersonal factor that came in. So like this teen says, finally, there just weren't enough little things to live for. There were reasons, but they just weren't big enough. They weren't enough to make me want to keep living. Guilt and shame were other ones that came up too as catalysts. So there's this whole thing we see a lot, especially with depressed teens, of having this negative self-schema, such as being defective, wrong, or the problem, that seem to contribute more to worsening suicidal thoughts than the actual catalyst transitioning them from ideation to attempt, okay? So like this teen says, my mom loves me to death. It breaks me inside because I love her, but I want nothing to do with her. It's so hard because I can't help the way I feel. I can't help that I don't want anything to do with her. And it's hard because she loves me so much. And she knows she doesn't deserve that. That's another huge reason why I tried doing what I was doing, tried to kill myself because of that. So this is a teen wrestling with that, differentiation from mom and feeling guilty about it and not being able to make sense of it in the moment. Hopelessness was interesting because I thought maybe this would be more of a catalyst than it ended up being. Instead, it seemed to be that this theme didn't exist without the presence of these other themes. It was always, double coated with other factors, which means it was never alone as a reason. There were always other intrapersonal factors that were along with this. So it seemed to be then that hopelessness was a consequence of other emotionally unbearable, long-standing contributing factors like chronic medical or psychiatric symptoms, things like that. Family conflict, and like kids would say things like, the world's not working out for me, I'm losing the game of life. So again, it's this negative like self schema, like negative schema of life, just feeling like it's life, it's not going to get better. And it's really that this kind of concrete thinking, and which seemed to really worsen their own suicidal thoughts rather than be the thing that pushed them from ideation to action. Okay, so I'll see if there's any questions related to that second one. Any difference between males and females? Our sample was too small to make those, to really look across gender, unfortunately. We also had a couple transgender individuals in our study too. Unfortunately, we weren't really able to see differences at this point. But yeah, I can totally see why we think for females, that might be stronger. Although that's not something that came up. We only had, I want to say maybe 4 males in the study. So we didn't really have enough. Okay. This one I think is a really interesting question that an interesting thing that came up is this idea of the time between thinking about suicide and actually attempting. We were curious of like, okay, how much time does pass by? And at the time, there was this, when we started this study, there was a big debate about the fact that, there's no such thing as an impulsive suicide attempt. And I felt very strongly with my clinical work, I don't think that's the case for teenagers. I think there is something different, that is going on within teens because of where they're at in their brain development, where, I thought that a lot of times it happened really quickly. They had the idea and they act on it. So we wanted to look at this. So here's what we found. We found that of the 20, 17 reported that the amount of time that elapsed, sorry about the typo there, between thinking about suicide to actually attempting was less than 3 hours. Now, among which on its own is, oh wow, that's a small amount of time. But when you break it down even more, 75%, so 15 kids said it was less than 30 minutes from when they thought about it to acted on it. And as you can see here, there are 8 of them that was less than 5 minutes. So that's a short window to intervene. One even reported not thinking at all before acting. And then the other, so that was one outlier. And then 2 other outliers were that they thought about it for an entire day. None thought about it for more than a day. None in the sample. So what does this mean? So of the 17 teens, 12 made that transition from ideation to action in 10 minutes or less. So this, echoes previous research showing that this acute period of heightened risk for suicidal behavior is often only minutes long. And this brief period of escalated risk represents an extremely short window of time in which to intervene, which further shows the importance of means safety in its ability to prevent suicide. And we know this too from the epi stuff I presented earlier on this firearm, the increase in firearm deaths. So how can we most effectively clinically intervene? Well, our therapeutic, and this is from our study, what we're gleaning from this, is that the therapeutic modalities we use, they really need to include cognitive behavioral techniques that challenge thought distortions that emerge in the context of this strain. And this idea that they can't manage what's going on, that suicide is the only option. This is one key element. The other thing that came out of this for me, thinking about it clinically, is how important emotion regulation techniques are for these kids. Because if some of these teens had a better ability to sit with the interpersonal issues that were happening for them in the moment and sit through them and do what they needed to do to help themselves, that they may have been able to, ride the wave of that emotion. This is critical for school social work because, I'm guessing there's a lot of you here who work in elementary schools, and these emotion regulation techniques really need to be incorporated with kids as young as kindergarten, pre-K. These are teaching kids, and I know a lot of schools do it, which is excellent, but this is relatively new that schools are starting to do this. But these are the skills kids need to start practicing when they're little. So they're learning as they're getting older how to use them. Other techniques that are needed are those that address these feelings of invalidation and feeling trapped, because these were two big pieces that were contributors in our study to why these kids actually tried to kill themselves. So that the idea that it's first identifying how they're feeling, and second, learning specific skills about how to help themselves, either cognitive behavioral, dialectical behavioral, is going to be key here. So in conclusion from this study, we know we need to go beyond just risk factors as a way of determining what makes an adolescent actually go from thinking about suicide to actually trying to kill themselves. We need to understand the interplay of these contributors and how they interact together to confer risk. And especially with the intrapersonal factors, which really seem to be the catalyst in this process from suicide ideation to action in this study. And then, speaking more concretely for what everyone in this Zoom is thinking is we need to really find strategies, and we have some that are evidence-based that we'll talk about later on today. But we need strategies that address these cognitive distortions that come up, emotion dysregulation, feelings of being invalidated, being trapped, as potential targets of interventions and prevention practices for teens at risk for suicide. Okay, so before we go into roll schools can play, I'm going to quickly look at this. Total N was 20. It was, yep. Oh, it's here. Okay. So now, easing more into the role that schools can play. The beauty of schools and school social work is you get to see the teen in their, natural environment, which is the school. Schools can play a role with respect to suicide risk screening, assessment, prevention programs that are, universal or, indicated. We have schools can do interventions, and if there is a suicide death, schools need to do postvention work. This is a book that if your school's interested in looking for like the soup to nuts, like the whole entire, like covering all of these things in an easy to read way, you might want to take a look at this book and see if it might be something that would be helpful for your school or your school social workers. It's really less for school social workers and more for teachers to know, to feel more equipped of how to deal with this, because one role of school social work too is helping empower the teachers to feel like and realize what a difference they're making. it's the teachers who are really on the front lines a lot of the times with these kids. They're the ones who know these kids because they see them every single day in class. So it's helping equip the teachers with the skills they need to feel confident, to feel competent in their ability to identify and assess and know what to do when there's a kid at risk. But with respect to school social work, it's knowing proper screening, assessment, and intervention skills is vital. And so that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of the time today. And feel free to keep putting in questions if you have them.